What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Juicy Delicious Love Podcast. I'm Coach Kim, and I'm here to dive in with you. Let's explore what it means to get to know and love ourselves better, what it takes to make our relationships amazing. We're talking love, sex, breakups, and more. You deserve a life and love that's juicy and delicious, and I'm here to help you get it. Let's go.
I'm so excited to be back with you. Today, we're going to talk about really just the basics of what is intimacy. I just came off of a long, beautiful weekend training with the Somatica Institute. I'm in their spring 2023 core program, and it is dense and heavy sometimes and juicy, and I'm learning so much. And really, what's been at the top of my mind lately is just intimacy. What does intimacy mean to me? And I'm curious, what does it mean to you? I think when I hear the word, sometimes my brain goes straight to sexuality, something sexual, being intimate, right? When people see, oh, Kim's an intimacy coach, they immediately think sex coach. And yes, it is all of that, right? But intimacy is not just sexual, right? It's also just closeness. It's this ability to feel really deep, meaningful closeness with someone. And, oh, you can think about like who are your intimate relationships, right? Not in a sexual sense, but just in the sense of who do I feel really close to? Or another way to say it might be, who do I really feel like I can fully be myself with? Um, and so you could compare relationships to, like, if you're not very close with your neighbors, what does it feel like to be with a neighbor versus with your sister who's like your best friend, or your brother who's like your best friend? So with the neighbor, it's like your posture, the words that you use, the version of you that shows up with the neighbor or someone who you're not really that close with is different, right? Like the energy is different. Maybe we put on this mask of politeness, right? So you might be a little bit more formal and use certain manners to convey, I'm a nice person. You're trying to send messages to people all the time about who you are. And the way that you show up with one person is different than another. Another example would be how you are interacting or showing up with a lover versus a coworker. So I know for me, if I am in the presence of my lover, I am softer, I am more playful. You can even feel my energy change now while I talk about it, right? Like it's like, oh, my lover, right? And then my coworker, the vibe is different, right? And so I think that relates a lot to what level of intimacy we have in different relationships, yeah? But intimacy, it feels so good. I think we all long for a sense of belonging, right? Like it's hardwired into us to want to feel like not only do we belong somewhere and with someone, but that we are acceptable, and not just acceptable, but valued, right? Like fully seen and appreciated for who we are. And as much as we all long for that, I dare say it's rare. It's pretty rare to have all kinds of just, oh, I show up vulnerably as me, completely. I got no filter, no masks. I'm just completely authentic 100% of the time. And I feel like fully received and never judged, and there's no shame. Like that's just not most of our lives. And so how do we cultivate spaces and relationships and even community where intimacy, closeness, and being able to show up as we are and feeling fully seen and received, but also fully seeing and receiving those that are in that relationship with us. How do we do that? And so, one of the things I've been studying and learning as part of the Somatica Institute trainings lately is, these kind of three, there's probably more than three, right? But there's three requirements for intimacy, at least, right? And I want to talk about those three things today because, first of all, they're learnable, they're teachable, and there are practices that we can do together that help us to get better at these things because they're not easy, they're hard. Like intimacy does not come easy to most of us because we have so many life experiences where we have felt shamed, rejected, um, and those wounds, they persist, right? They like live in our bodies, right? So many of us have trauma and just shitty experiences with relating to other people. So, intimacy can be challenging, but oh so rewarding. And so, yeah, let's talk about these some baseline requirements for intimacy and kind of how, and maybe we can think, right, while I'm talking to you, you can kind of think about how they apply in your life. So, the first one, I already said this word once, is vulnerability. So, what is vulnerability? Being vulnerable. Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is if I'm vulnerable, I want to know that I'm safe. So I think we do a pretty good job, at least with someone who's, I have enough pain in my past that I'm pretty hyper vigilant about assessing whether or not I'm safe to be vulnerable. So I can pretty quickly pick up on in the environment around me and make assessments of the people around me as to whether or not I think that it's safe for me to be vulnerable with them. But safety is really key. And so let's talk a little bit about safety. Like, how do you create a sense of safety in yourself? And how do you know if you're safe with others, right? So I think one thing is that the first thing is creating safety within ourselves or knowing that, if we choose to be vulnerable and things don't go well, right? Or someone says something. If I'm being very vulnerable with you, I'm like, hey, man, this is me. I'm here. I'm showing you myself. And you're like, oh, I don't like you. Like if you reject me or you're like, oh, you shouldn't be that way. Maybe you judge me or shame me. Like, oh, that's not safe. And I might immediately feel like, oof, I was being vulnerable. And then that happened and like, oh, that there's like a little bit, I feel a little pain. I feel a little bit of wounding from that, right? So I need to know that if I'm being vulnerable and something hurts me, or I discover that, I'm not as safe as I want to be, I have to be able to go into my body and have some wellspring or source of resilience. I have to be able to know that even if other people don't receive me or don't accept me or judge me or shame me, if even if my vulnerability doesn't make sense with some people and the response I get hurts, am I able to bounce back from that hurt? Do I have some strategy for bouncing back, some strategy for resilience? Um, and so that's kind of key to vulnerability. Like I gotta know that I can, I have the resources internally and maybe other resources externally, like my therapist, my best friend, my lover. I have some external resources, going out, even things that I do, going out in nature, journaling, um, meditation. There's a whole like basket of things that I do that like I know like if I have a tough moment, if I'm being vulnerable, or even just in general, if I'm having a tough moment and I'm struggling, I have a list of things that I can pull from to help me bounce back. So that helps me create safety within myself, right? But then also there's like, am I safe with somebody else? If I'm gonna be vulnerable with you, which I feel like I am right now, um, I need to know that you're not gonna judge me, you're not gonna shame me, that that you like me the way that I am, that you're able to, even if there's things about me that you're like, that's not my favorite quality in the whole world that some people have, right? Like, but that I know that um, I can still show up as me and it's just okay. Like, it's just okay for me to be how I am. And so, safety with someone else, safety with you, that's what that means for me, right? But you have to decide, what does safety mean for you with other people? And then determine in your interactions with your friends, your colleagues, your partners, are those people embodying the kind of safety that you need for intimacy, right? And if not, then there's an opportunity either for a conversation about what you need and maybe some boundaries, or maybe it's not a good fit. Maybe that's just not a person that you need to be intimate with, right? And again, intimacy might be close, it might be sexual, or it might be closeness, it just might be deep friendship, right? But not everyone is safe. So that's my key point, is that at this stage, not everybody is going to feel safe or going to be safe for you to be vulnerable with. So for the first baseline requirement for intimacy, vulnerability, like safety is huge, right? But what is vulnerability? Like, what do I even mean by that? And really, it's just about having just this moment of confession, really, like humility, whatever you want to call it, to just say, like, I'm human as fuck. I don't have it all figured out, right? Like, I mean, that's me saying that. Like, I don't have it all figured out. Like, there's just things in my life that I'm still figuring out. There's areas that I'm still trying to grow, and I'm just not always sure, and I don't always have the right answers. I definitely don't always get it right with my friends or my lover or my, family. Like, I just don't always get it right. I'm freaking human. And I'm learning to be able to, like, say that without feeling bad about it, Like, but what happens when I tell you I'm human, like, I'm not always gonna get it right, is that there is this, like, automatic, energetic permission for you to be human. You just get to be human too. And so vulnerability is about me not feeling the need to pretend that there's anything different about me, I'm not trying to pretend that I'm something that I think you want or need me to be or expect me to be. I'm not trying to should all over myself, like, I'm not walking around saying, "Oh, well, I should do this or I should do that," or just, essentially I'm just really taking the mask off and taking the armor off, and I'm saying, "Here I am. It's just me." And with my wounds and with my flaws, I'm just here, and this is me. And I would like to be me with you. And I would like to see you too. And I'm willing to be vulnerable because I'm believing that I'm safe with you and you're safe with me. And we can just be here as we are together. Right. And there's things that go along with that, right? Like, it's not just standing there staring at each other, being silent, here, it's me, right? It's like honesty. It's about saying how I'm feeling, even if I think you might be disappointed. That takes vulnerability, right? But then, man, if I do that and then you're like, oh, now I really know how you feel and I care about how you feel. Now there's like, oh, you care. Like, not only are you not judging me or angry with me, you actually care about my experience. Now we become closer. right? So that's how vulnerability plays into intimacy, right? We're both human, we're both figuring it out, and we're both gonna make mistakes. And I just am willing to let you see me in my humanness, and I want to see you in your humanness. And we're safe to come together and just be human and be how we are, exactly as we are together. Vulnerability, a requirement for intimacy. Yeah. Okay, so the second one, the second big requirement for intimacy is self awareness. And another word for this might be mindfulness. Uh, and really, what that means, it sounds obvious, self awareness, but let's just kind of talk it out and flesh it out, right? So, self awareness is being able to say, I'm able to see myself, I'm able to see my habits, I'm able to see how I tend to show up, and even maybe how others have been impacted by the way I show up in my experiences, right? I guess that's maybe a little into like others awareness, but I've shown up in the world a certain way. I know how I've shown up throughout my life in different seasons. I know how it's impacted others. Um, and because of that, the there's a mindfulness, right? Where not only do I know how I am, how I can be in both the most beautiful ways and maybe in the most frustrating ways. Because I have that knowledge, I'm able to see myself when I'm moving into certain patterns that I have in relationships and slow down to consider, are the choices, like, I have choices to make right now as to how I behave, how I show up, how I express myself. And I can ask myself the question, are my choices, or are the choices I'm about to make, are they choices that nourish love and connection and intimacy? Or do they nourish constriction, separation, distance? Yeah. I mean, for me, I know that, if I offer you some kind of love and your reaction for whatever reason and if I tell some kind of story about your reaction where I'm like, oh, this person's rejecting me, you're rejecting me, or you don't want my love, then, my tendency is to constrict, to distance myself, right? And I know that about myself. I have that self awareness that I have a tendency, if I'm thinking you might be rejecting me, my tendency is to withdraw. So, knowing that when you say the thing that I may be interpreting as rejection, I can pause. I can feel that constriction in me and I can slow down. And then I have a choice to make. And I can say, I'm noticing that I feel an urge to pull away when you said that. And I don't want to make assumptions about what you mean. So I just want to get curious, right? And whether I say that out loud or not, internally, I can say to myself, you know what, let's just get really curious. That might not mean what I think it means. That the story that I'm making up about this person's rejecting me, that might not mean what I think it means. And so I have this opportunity, instead of constricting, which detracts from intimacy, I can expand. I can go into expansion and I can say, oh, I'm going to open to what you just said and I'm going to be curious about it. What does that what does that mean? Can you tell me more about that reaction? Because I really want to understand you. I want to know what that means. Self-awareness. And the other thing about self-awareness is some of us have self-awareness about kind of how we show up and the things that we do. A lot of us are way more aware of the things we do that we're maybe feeling critical of, or things we have been criticized for. And so part of self-awareness also, for it to add to intimacy, there has to be, like, you have to remove the criticism from it. Like, you can't be judging and criticizing and shaming yourself all the time and then call that self-awareness, like, oh, I know I'm a piece of shit, like, or I know I'm stupid in this area, or I know, like if your self-talk and your just inner dialogue and the way you feel about yourself is really crappy, that is not going to add to intimacy, right? Because you're not going to open to somebody else if you feel shame. If you're like, oh, this part of me is bad and wrong, right? So the idea behind really productive, intimacy inspiring self-awareness is that you are lovingly seeing yourself as you are. And there's I can't think of his name right now, so you can put it in the comments and remind me. But he wrote Biology of Belief, and he gave a talk, and I watched this talk that he gave where he talked about that each of us has, now whether you are a spiritual person and you believe in God or any kind of higher power, or even if you're not, right? There's this idea that we have this internal, or we can cultivate this internal voice for ourselves. And the word that he used to describe it was a wise advocate. That inside we have a wise and loving advocate. So this voice is always on our side. And so this voice might say like, hey, you have a tendency to get a little defensive when something like that happens or when you feel a certain way. And that detracts from intimacy. There's no judgment there. That is an objective statement about a behavior that you do. It's not saying, oh, here you go again, right? That's a different vibe, right? So along with self-awareness, you're wanting to cultivate the ability to objectively notice the ways that you show up with compassion and with love and with curiosity, right? If you really dig into like some way that you're showing up that you feel like is not beneficial in your relationships, if you really take the time to be lovingly curious about where that's coming from, it almost always goes back to some way that you've been really hurt, and it's just a wound, an open sore that when someone else does something, it taps on it. And so you're like, wow, right? Of course you are, right? Like if you stick your finger in my boo-boo, I'm gonna raw too. Like that's absolutely, you're protecting yourself, right? So self-awareness, but with the caveat that this is a non-judgment, like no shame, just developing the skill to see yourself, to be curious and lovingly curious about how you're showing up and whether or not it is nurturing or nourishing intimacy in your relationships. And if not, then slowing down, taking a breath and developing the ability to slow down, get curious and choose something different than your normal, right? Yeah. Okay, so we talked about vulnerability. We talked about vulnerability within the context of safety. We're talking about self-awareness within the context of not judging, right? Like being loving toward ourselves. And then number 3 is empathy. And empathy, we use this word all the time. I've heard it defined in a few different ways. It's like has some people kind of overlap empathy and sympathy. But when I talk about empathy, I'm saying we want to be able, not just able, but willing to feel what somebody else is feeling when they're feeling it, right? When someone expresses, I'm feeling blank, allowing ourselves to really sink in and say, okay, that feeling, like I want to feel that feeling right now as if I were them in their experience. I'm really going to sink in and feel what they're feeling right now. Because when we do that, we begin to leave behind who is right, who is wrong, what is right, what is wrong. And we begin to join people in their experience, which allows us to connect to what they're feeling, to what they're living. It also allows them to really feel met and seen, right? So, empathy, man, is so crucial. And the cool thing, really, really cool, even like if we add on to this empathy concept, is if you really make empathy a goal, in a relationship, when someone's, just telling you about what their life is like, or maybe you're talking about something between the two of you, right? If you really sink in and just commit yourself to seeing and feeling their experience from their perspective without having to inject your perspective or your opinion or your solutions, no problem solving. If you really just sit with the reality of their experience, it's like 90% of the problem is solved for that person just because you were able to witness them and be with them in whatever they're feeling. Talk about intimacy. Talk about closeness. Yeah. I mean, how many times have you like vented to someone about something and they're just like, well, why don't you do this? And you're like, at least for me, I'm like, yeah, I could do that. And also, I mean, yeah, I've spent a lot of time at this thing that I'm frustrated with, and I've already brainstormed the 500 possible solutions. And I'm not sitting here venting necessarily because I need you to tell me what you think I should do or ask me why I haven't already done XYZ. Typically, if I'm talking about it, it's just because I'm feeling some kind of way. And I'm just feeling it, right? So it's a whole different experience if I'm feeling some kind of way and the other person is like, yeah, that feels like shit. Who does that? Ugh, and they like really just be with me in that. And then I'm just like, oh, and then what happens? And I'm like, thanks. Like seriously. And I've just released and they've released with me. And now I'm good, right? Now I'm like, okay, I got all that out of my system. And now I'm okay. Now I'm just going to do the thing I know I need to do, the solution, right? Like, I mean, that's just one example. There's a million other like situations where empathy is just, ugh, it's like throwing gasoline on the fire of intimacy because it's amazing to feel like someone is with you in how you're feeling and you're not alone and you're not fucking weird for what you're feeling. Like, you really want to be close with someone, dive in to what they're feeling without trying to expect them to feel any other kind of way than what they're actually feeling, right? Because we're all unique. We all have like a whole lifetime of experiences that are completely different than each other, right? So none of us are going to feel the same way about any one thing, right? So the effort to like understand this other person's experience as it is for them, and to sit with them in that is just freaking. It's an offering. It's a beautiful offering that brings you closer together. Yeah. So, vulnerability, I'm human, be human with me. Even when I look at you and I say that, I'm like, will you be human with me? Like, I don't have it all figured out. And I have wounds and I have struggles. And I just want to be with you in our wounds and struggles, right? That feels so intimate. Yeah. And then self-awareness, like saying like, hey, I get that sometimes I show up a certain way, but I'm really actively like slowing down to make sure that the way that despite my tendencies and my habits, I'm like I'm really making an effort to make sure that the way I show up for you is really connecting and enhancing our closeness. And I have this inner wise voice that's saying, hey, Kimmy, what you really want is to be close to her or close to him. And the thing that you sometimes do is not helping that. So let's figure out what that's about. Let's be curious. And then let's see if we can shift and move and flow in a way that is more intimacy promoting. How amazing is that for our relationships, right? And then empathy. Yeah. Empathy was the last one. The third one, the third requirement, baseline requirement for intimacy. So this is like a set of qualities, values, but more than anything, skills. These are skills that are teachable and practicable. And that, it doesn't even matter if like your loved one or the people you're in relationships with are watching podcasts like these where they're thinking about this stuff, because you become this beacon. You start to practice and dive into practicing these, and you become a beacon of safety and intimacy, and you become attractive, like magnetic, because people are like, oh, I want to feel like the way I feel when I'm with that person, right? And you start to model this in your relationships, and it's profoundly impactful. It changes everything when you start to really think like, how can I cultivate more intimacy and closeness and safety and vulnerability, empathy and self-awareness in my life? Mm. So the invitation today is to just kind of ask yourself, in what ways would I like to maybe just dip a toe into the pool of being more vulnerable in how you show up in your relationships? And you could be creative, right? It might be being a little more vulnerable in how you show up at work. It might be being a little bit more vulnerable in how you show up in the bedroom. It might be being a little more vulnerable in how you show up with your community or your family or with your children. Yeah. And some of you might want to just dip a toe into being more vulnerable. And some of you might just want to strip off the armor and say, you know what? I'm going to show up as a human today. And that's great too. I would love to hear about it. However you decide to expand in your vulnerability after today. And then, or today. And then, okay, so looking inward, maybe you're like already showing up super vulnerable and you're like, oh, but I really want I want to be more self-aware. Or maybe you're pretty self-aware, but you have this internal voice that isn't so kind and is maybe a little judgy or shamey, right? So maybe the invitation for you is to say, you know what, like I really want to cultivate my inner wise advocate, this wise and loving voice that is my voice or God's voice, or, whatever you believe, whatever helps you. This voice that has so much wisdom and wants nothing but everything for you, right? They're on your side, and your inner wise advocate wants your wildest dreams to come true. What does he say? What does she say to you about who you are and how you're showing up and what needs to shift for your highest good? What needs to shift for your highest good? Not because you're bad or wrong, not because there's anything wrong with you. There's no shame in roaring like a lion when someone pokes a deep, painful wound. Oftentimes, you don't even know the wound is there. So you just think you're roaring like a lion and you're a crappy person. And that's just not the case. There's something there, right? So, how can you cultivate the inner voice that says, hey, baby, that hurts for a reason? That anger's coming up for a reason. Let's get curious about it. I want to help you because I don't want this to keep you from your highest, most beautiful dreams. I want to work with you through it. I want to help you. I want to love you through this. I want to heal you through this so that we can keep moving in the direction of beautiful love and closeness and intimacy. Yeah? So maybe that's you today. Maybe you're like, I got to work on this, how I talk to myself, right? I need to cultivate a loving, curious self awareness. Yeah. And then number 3, into empathy. Empathy. How do I how can I practice more empathy in my life? How can I take time to like actually let go of what how I think things should be, how I think other people should feel or react, how I think other people should even behave? And what if I just take on the willingness, if I just begin to embody this willingness to validate everybody else's experience as right. The way that you experience that is the way that you experience that. I'm not going to tell you you should experience it any other way. In fact, taking it a step further, empathy. I'm going to sit and I'm going to go, oh, you're feeling angry. Okay. Anger. Yeah. Angry. I know what it feels like to feel angry. It's not a fun feeling, right? Like it's it's activating. And you feel angry about that thing. I'm going to sit here, I'm going to feel it with you. Cuz fuck that. If I were you, if had your experiences, if I went through what you just went through, I would be feeling angry too. Fuck that. Right? So maybe you're just going out into the world and you're just practicing empathy and validating that other people's experiences and feelings are perfectly fine, right? And please don't mishear. Someone feeling angry about something doesn't justify any old kind of behavior in the world, but their feelings are their feelings. Yeah? If we want to have intimate relationships, the people we want to be close with need to know that their feelings are valid with us and that we can sit there and feel with them. So maybe that's you. Maybe empathy is something that you need to stretch into. You feel that, you're like, oh, yeah, I got to work on that. Well, this is your opportunity. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the invitation is just to like consider I want more closeness in my relationships with my lover, with my friends, whatever it is for you. You're wanting to feel more seen. You want your loved ones to feel seen by you. You want to feel like you belong. You want others to feel like they belong when they're with you. All of this is intimacy. Practice showing up vulnerably. Practice cultivating that loving self awareness and that inner guiding voice. Practice getting away from judgment or shame or problem solving and just having empathy for your loved ones and see how your intimacy blossoms. Yeah? I freaking love you guys. I love talking about this stuff. And I would love to know what your thoughts are. So hit me up in the comments and I'll see you next time.